Hello bassoonists! In this video I'm going to give you a basic introduction to the contrabassoon. What is the contrabassoon? How does it differ from the regular bassoon? I'm going to demonstrate a few things, and I'm also going to give you some basic tips on how to get started playing contrabassoon if you ever find yourself in the position where you're needing to play it. My name is Dr. Natalie Law, and I'm a professional bassoonist and teacher, and I love to help people just like you learn how to play the bassoon, and in this case the contrabassoon, and improve your skills so that you can feel confident playing this instrument. If that's a topic of interest to you, I would love to have you subscribe to the channel, like the video if it's interesting, and comment any questions or anything down below. So let's get to it. So one of the main differences between the bassoon and the contrabassoon is range, obviously. The contrabassoon, like the bassoon, is in concert pitch, meaning that the note that you see written on the page is the note that you hear coming from the instrument, with one exception. It's pitched an octave lower. So, for example, the low B flat on regular bassoon is the equivalent to the B flat in the staff on contrabassoon. Another big difference is with the reeds. This is a contrabassoon reed and this is a bassoon reed. So the contrabassoon reed is obviously bigger because the notes are lower, and so you need the reed to be bigger to accommodate for those low vibrations. Another difference between contrabassoon and regular bassoon is the fingerings. So the fingerings are somewhat in the realm of bassoon fingerings. Some of them are exactly the same and some of them are very similar, and some of them are completely different. So for example, you don't really have a dedicated whisper key on the contrabassoon, whereas that's a really important element to understand on regular bassoon. You don't do things like half holes or flicking on contra because you don't need to. So there's slightly different fingerings for those types of notes that we typically use half holes or flicking on bassoon. But the fingering is going to differ a little bit. Especially as you get into the upper register of the contrabassoon, the fingerings get wildly different. Just like on bassoon, as you're going above the staff, the fingerings get kind of wacky and they don't seem very sequential. Contrabassoon is the same way. As it goes higher, it gets in more and more interesting, and it doesn't necessarily track with what you do on bassoon. The pitch tendencies on contra tend to be different. So certain notes that might be sharp or flat on bassoon are going to have slightly different pitch tendencies on contra, and that's going to differ by what contra you play. I would say that, among bassoons, obviously every instrument's very different, but among bassoons, there's more continuity in pitch tendencies. For example, the low register tends to be really sharp. E and F above the staff tend to be on the flatter side. Certain notes tend to be super sharp or super flat. But on the contra, at least in my experience, having played different models and individual instruments, that continuity or that sort of universal pitch tendency goes out the window on contrabassoon. Because what I have found is that every single contra I play, the pitch is just different and there's different tendencies. So there's less sort of global universal pitch things that I can tell you about contra. You kind of have to try it out for yourself based on the instrument that you have, based on the reed you have, which we'll talk about that in a second, and what's going on in the music that you're playing. A big difference between contra and bassoon is just the size and how it looks. So I can't even really get this whole thing in frame on the camera. So obviously one thing that people kind of immediately notice is that there's this sort of rounding on the top here. And that's just how the instrument is bent around itself to accommodate for how much tubing there is. Basically the contra has twice the amount of tubing or feet of tubing than the bassoon, so it needs to wrap around itself more so than the bassoon does to be able to be ergonomic and playable. Some contras, especially more modern, newer models, have a tuning slide in this part that you can actually pull in or pull out, and that's how you can adjust overall pitch on the contra. This particular contra that I have is a very, very old Heckel that is on loan to me right now, and it has a fixed pitch. It has a fixed pipe. You can't adjust the overall pitch of the instrument. So that makes it a little bit more tricky because you have to just make sure that you're, just like on bassoon, you have to make sure your reeds are in good condition playing everything around the instrument. I find sometimes, especially when I'm playing on different contras that I'm maybe not as familiar with, I will sometimes question my pitch in an ensemble because I just don't have that muscle memory of where to place it. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit later about, renting, buying a contrabassoon, how do you acquire a contrabassoon. I personally don't own a contrabassoon, so because I rent basically contrabassoons, or I borrow contrabassoons, it's not always the same instrument, and so I can't, I don't have that muscle memory or that, ease of playing that you get with your own instrument when you've had, years and years of playing on it. So that can be a little bit tricky, especially if you're not, a dedicated contra player playing on the same instrument all the time. There's almost always a spit valve, basically kind of like brass instruments, which is unlike the regular bassoon. That's how you get water out, because water accumulates in this kind of tubing. That's where the water kind of tends to sit. And so the spit valve allows it to come out. There's no swabbing of a contrabassoon. Can you imagine trying to swab all of this tubing? It would be quite the feat for sure. There's no really disassembly of the contrabassoon. There's no seat strap to the contrabassoon. How the contrabassoon is supported is with an end pin like this. And there's usually a screw for adjusting the height of the end pin. And so it just sits, kind of the same idea as a seat strap, but it's just sitting on the ground rather than, you're sitting on a seat strap supporting the weight. You generally aren't able to stand playing contrabassoon. I suppose if you had a long enough and stable enough peg on the bottom, you probably could, or if you had a box to prop it on, I suppose you could stand and play with contra, but it's typically not standard to stand and play with contra. There's no sort of harness. Typically, you play it sitting down. And honestly, I'm not really sure I would want to play it standing up. I think things would get really, really difficult. So there's no assembly or disassembly of the contrabassoon. It doesn't break into a bunch of small parts. It's basically all just one thing that fits in a big case. And, the only thing that really goes together is the bocal. And so this bocal is quite a bit longer and bigger than a normal bassoon bocal. And there's a receiver right here where the bocal goes into, and just like on bassoon, you kind of wiggle it in there. So I want to talk a little bit about the contrabassoon's role in ensembles and classical music, just so you understand kind of where it fits. So thinking about the contrabassoon from the orchestra perspective, the contra is obviously a part of the bassoon section. They sit with the bassoons. And generally, contras are playing the same part as like the tubas, bass trombone, like the lowest of the low. If you're in an orchestra, string basses typically are all going to play the same part. Some band ensembles, especially like collegiate and more professional or advanced band ensembles, will have a contrabassoon in it as well, and it's the same kind of idea. You're playing with a low brass, not so much the trombones, more the tuba and the bass trombone. The contra, even more so than the bassoon, plays very much a supporting role, playing sort of the roots of chords, setting the pitch. Especially in an orchestra, but really any ensemble where you have bassoons and a contrabassoon, the contrabassoon is going to be the one that's setting the pitch. So if you're a second bassoonist and there's a contrabassoonist sitting next to you, you're ideally going to fit into their sound and you're going to listen for their pitch because they're usually an octave lower than you are. If that sounds totally foreign to you, you might want to check out my video on first and second bassoon playing. I'll link it somewhere up here. And I talk more about, first bassoon versus second bassoon and the roles that you have in the ensemble. And so contra is basically takes on the role that second bassoon would normally take on in an ensemble. And that goes for band, orchestra, chamber ensembles, etc. The character that the contrabassoon sometimes plays in music, if it's ever featured, is either as the beast from Ravel's Mother Goose, or it's a joker of sorts, but even more so than the bassoon. Sometimes the bassoon is the joker or kind of the quirky character, but the contrabassoon is like even more so, and maybe even more in the realm of sort of low brass humor, that low sound is kind of where that character comes from. All right, I want to end with some tips to get you started on contrabassoon. If you ever find yourself playing a contrabassoon, and how would you go about getting a contrabassoon, etc. And again, this is just a very basic intro. There's a lot of information that really would be impossible to cover in one video, but hopefully this kind of gives you an idea of where to start. When it comes to actually acquiring a contrabassoon, one question you might have is, well, where do I find a contrabassoon? Where do I rent a contrabassoon? Where do I buy a contrabassoon? Should I buy a contrabassoon? You generally are not going to purchase your own contrabassoon because they're very expensive, like bassoons, unless you are a professional bassoonist and you specialize in contrabassoon playing and you're getting a lot of work and you're playing a lot of contrabassoon. That would be really the only situation where you really would want to own your own contrabassoon. In most other situations, you're going to be borrowing or renting a contrabassoon from somewhere else. A lot of universities own contrabassoons, and so students who study at those universities and sometimes community members can sometimes access that instrument. And sometimes orchestras will own their own contrabassoon and allow their players to play the contra. Sometimes individuals who own contras will rent out their contras to people for a fee. I believe there's a way similar to renting bassoons online that you can rent a contra. I believe Vocal Majority might be a company that does rent contras, but don't quote me on that. If I find information on it, I'll link it down below and you can check it out for yourself because I'm not experienced with how that typically works. Typically you're renting or you're borrowing a contrabassoon, and so a lot of times you're kind of stuck with what you got. Sometimes the contrabassoon has not seen maintenance in many years, unfortunately, because just like the bassoon, it's very expensive and finicky to maintain. I personally do not own a contrabassoon. I happen to have this contrabassoon on loan to me from an individual because I'm playing with an orchestra this week that's requiring me to play contrabassoon, and this individual is renting it to the orchestra. The orchestra is renting the contra, and I am just using it for this orchestra cycle. And I've actually never played on this contra, and so this was my first time playing on it, and there were some interesting things that I had to learn as I was practicing the part in terms of pitch. And this particular contrabassoon didn't have the tuning slide, which I'm more accustomed to on newer models, but it actually is a very beautiful old heckle. I actually love this contrabassoon. I get asked to play contrabassoon occasionally for orchestra concerts. When an orchestra hires me to play, they might want me to play contrabassoon or third bassoon and contrabassoon, where you're switching back and forth. So I do not consider myself a contrabassoon specialist. I actually have too short of thumbs really to play contrabassoon very successfully, because the reach on the contra, you're reaching your thumb around here, it's a lot bigger than bassoon. So if you have small hands, that can sometimes be tricky. There are certain workarounds with that, especially if you own your own contra and can make some adjustments. But for the most part, I just kind of deal with it. And there's some notes that it's just, I can't reach them very well. And I'm never going to be a contrabassoon specialist, mainly for that reason. And also because it's not something that I've been incredibly interested in before, even though I've done quite a bit of contra playing. So if you do find yourself in possession of a contrabassoon, here are some tips to actually kind of learn it. The first thing I would recommend is to get a good contrabassoon fingering chart. And there are a number of fingering charts out there that people have put together, and they're all slightly different, even more so than bassoon fingering charts, because again, contras are so different, one instrument to the next and one brand to the next. So even with just a Google search for contrabassoon fingering charts, you'll find a number of options. And you might need to kind of check out multiple options and try different fingerings on the contrabassoon, because one fingering chart might just not work. So you search around and see if there's an alternative that you can use, and just kind of cobble together some fingerings that work for your particular instrument. I will link down to one particular contrabassoon fingering chart that I think is helpful, because it has, in addition to fingering, some extra information and helpful tips for playing contra, and that's Richard Bobo's contrabassoon fingering chart. He also has a YouTube channel that has some interesting bassoon, contrabassoon content on it that you should check out. I'll try to link that down below as well. But that's the one I would maybe initially start with and see if that gives you what you need. The other thing that you will need for contrabassoon is contra reeds. Especially if you're not playing contra a lot, you definitely want to be purchasing your reeds from someone. I will link down a couple of places where I might buy contra reeds. I myself make bassoon reeds. I don't make contrabassoon reeds, especially not commercially, because it's not, a specialty of mine. And the nice thing about contra reeds is, especially if you're not playing contrabassoon all the time, they will last a lot longer than bassoon reeds. And so you can buy a couple of contrabassoon reeds, and if they work, great. They'll probably last you for multiple years. When it comes to holding the contrabassoon, you have the peg on the bottom of the contra that supports the weight of the contra. It's kind of similar how when you're playing bassoon that you put your music kind of to your right side so that you can see it and your bassoon's not in the way. It's the exact same idea on contra, because you don't want to be playing like this. You can't put the contra straight in front of you. You want to kind of have it off to the side, and it's going to be between your legs a little bit. And you want the reed to come in straight to your mouth, just like you do on bassoon. You don't want to be reaching up to it or looking down to get to it. You want it to come straight in. So you got to adjust the height of the peg to get it to that point. And you got to put your music usually kind of off to the side. So when I'm playing in orchestra, my bassoon colleagues will be sitting kind of straight forward, or how they normally do. And then I will be kind of off to the side, kind of looking at the conductor. When it comes to finger placement, your left thumb is generally going to be hovering above this button right here. And then you're going to have your 3 fingers on 3 keys, 1, 2, 3 in the left hand, and then 1, 2, 3 in the right hand. And then similar to bassoon, you're going to put your right thumb would be the equivalent of the pancake key. It's going to be hovering around in that region. And the keys are generally further apart, so your hands might be a little bit more stretched than what you're used to, and that's normal. A misconception might be that, you could be just a contrabassoon player and not a bassoon player, and that's just not true. Even professional contrabassoonists, like people who mostly play contrabassoon professionally, are really great at contrabassoon, they're also amazing at bassoon. You can't be a contrabassoonist without being a bassoonist, because there's so much crossover. The contrabassoon is absolutely a part of the bassoon family, and so the skills interlap back and forth, even though there are some distinct differences. The things that you would normally practice on bassoon, scales, arpeggios, etc., are going to be helpful on contra. You need to do the same thing, especially with pitch. I mentioned the intonation can be wildly different. You need to sit with a tuner and go chromatically up and down the entire range of the contra and figure out where all those notes are sitting, and maybe mark, which ones are particularly sharp or particularly flat, so you can adjust for that. And the adjustments that you'd make on contra are pretty similar to bassoon. It's just a bigger reed and it's a bigger instrument, so it feels a little bit more unwieldy in some ways, but you do get used to it after a while. The weight of the contrabassoon it's definitely heavier than bassoon, but this particular contra, like I mentioned, is an old Heckel, so it's actually very light and sort of compact. Some newer contra, Fox makes some pretty popular contras that you'll find a lot, and those contras are much heavier and bigger. I mean, they definitely feel much more bulky. So there is some variance between contras, but it's definitely bigger and bulkier than bassoon for sure. So you have to just be extra careful when you're walking around with it. When you're walking with a contra, it's best to support it kind of from this middle piece, this middle tube. Never, ever, ever on any contra should you lift it from this top tubing. It's often not strong enough in that part of the instrument to support the whole weight. So you want to sort of hold it from the center, kind of in between where your hands normally would play on the contra is where you'd want to hold it from, and you want to hold it kind of close to your body so that you just reduce the risk of bumping into something or someone bumping into you. I got a question about contrabassoon. Does it make a bassoonist more marketable? I suppose if you play contrabassoon very proficiently, very well, does it make you more marketable? Yes and no, because every bassoonist, every professional bassoonist, if you go to university for bassoon, or you get paid to play bassoon or whatever, the expectation is that you know how to play contrabassoon. Everybody has to learn how to do it. It's a part of the bassoon family. So often we're asked to play contrabassoon in certain situations, and so you just have to learn how to do it if it's something, if you're going to be playing bassoon in any sort of professional capacity. So we all, technically, those of us who play professionally can play contra. Some of us are definitely better than others and prefer it and have more experience and work on it more. And so those people who tend to gravitate more towards contra tend to get asked to play contra. I have friends who specialize in contrabassoon, and people know that they're good at contrabassoon and like playing contrabassoon, and so they tend to get asked to play more contrabassoon. And so I suppose it can make you more marketable. I guess what makes you most marketable is if you own an instrument, because that's really the hard part, is actually acquiring a contrabassoon. So if you own an instrument and can play it well, you'll be pretty marketable. But that situation is just hard to come by because they're so expensive and difficult to own, basically. I do just want to quickly mention a new sort of type of contra is what's called the Contraforte. And it looks sort of similar to this, but definitely looks different. And it's a little bit more ergonomical to play, and it's a little bit more stable and, I guess, better built in some ways, but it is a whole different instrument, and it's definitely a modern instrument. It's sort of a modern rendition of the contrabassoon, kind of fixing some of those things. And some people do play contraforte professionally in orchestras. I have played one before. It's not as common as kind of contrabassoon. I don't know if it's going to eventually replace contrabassoon. Some people feel like it's not the same sound, it's not the same instrument, it's not what composers intended when they were writing for contrabassoon. And so I just want to mention the name Contraforte because it is out there and people do play it, and it does play the contrabassoon part, but it's a whole other topic that I'm not going to get to into this intro video. So I hope this video was helpful in giving you just a basic introduction to the contrabassoon. And like I said before, there are a lot more intricacies to the contrabassoon that we could talk about. We could get into different fingerings and what to do in specific situations and all the different famous contrabassoon solos. There's a lot more information out there, and I encourage you to keep researching and learn from others and whatnot, to learn about the contra, because it is kind of a fascinating instrument of its own right. But if you get started playing, I wish you the best of luck. Have fun playing contrabassoon. It's always fun to play it. And if this video was helpful for you, please give me a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let me know what you think of the contrabassoon.